to you too. Just take 1 minute to get situated and seated here in the room, and we'll get going. For folks in the room, if you are still hungry, there are some new snacks in the back of the room. Okay, I'm going to give everyone a little bit of a heads up on where we're headed. We actually have a couple of additional take-homes from webinar 2 to cover, and then we'll switch to webinar 3. And then, as we said at the beginning of the day, but just in case people are joining now at the midday mark, after we finish with the webinar conversation, we're going to switch to sort of what this group is doing together and creating for the department to guide its efforts. And then we'll talk about the small group and how the large and small group will work together. Also, for folks online, heads up, you have a new facilitator. Barton took off and is replaced by Emily. So if you have any questions, you can chat Emily, you can raise your hand, and she'll be helping us sort of make sure we're getting to all of the chat questions and working in your questions with the folks here in the room. All right, let's go ahead and finish up webinar 2.
Thanks, Teresa. So yeah, there was a couple of other pieces in webinar 2, which was an analysis done by NOAA and OSU looking at the future viability of some of the stocks in these hatcheries, and something I mentioned earlier in the piece here. They looked at different geographies, so Upper Columbia, Lower Columbia, North Coast, South Coast, and looked at representative programs for each of the species in each of those geographies, looked at their historic performance, and then what kind of factors, environmental factors, were correlated with that performance. And then you can make some assessment looking forward based on trends in those factors, what their likely representative program to performance is going to be in the future. And the main take homes there is that, not unexpectedly, that vulnerability does vary between stocks. You've got different freshwater life histories with those adults coming back, summer steelhead, for example, during summer, fall Chinook in the fall. That contributes to different vulnerabilities, but also they're going to different places in the ocean. And some of those stocks, the south turning ones on the south coast, for example, they're going into places that have lately at least been more hospitable than some of the north turning stocks. And then steelhead going offshore, been exposed to a lot of marine heat waves lately, and that's projected to continue increasing. So variability among stocks. Marine indicators, I think we all know this, really important to the performance of these stocks. And a lot of those marine indicators, unfortunately, are trending worse over time. And then of all the stocks I looked at, there's variability geography, but when you look at summer steelhead as a whole across all geographies, they're tending to trend downwards over time, and that is expected to continue over time. Again, it's a function of freshwater conditions with those adults coming back during the hottest time of year and having to be held during the hottest time of the year, as well as some of the marine conditions and exposure to marine heat waves, etc. The trout stocking programs, in contrast, as you might expect, they're much more adapted, much more resilient and adaptable. And with trout, we also have the opportunity to use strains from different parts of the country that are adapted to warmer temperatures. We can move stocking around. We can stock different locations. So there's much more potential there for trout than for some of our salmon steelhead. So I don't think there was anything particularly surprising in this analysis if you've followed some of the trends lately, but it did do a good job of a really thorough analysis of some of our programs, and it'll be good to see the final report of that.
Thanks, Sean. So we'll take a minute here just to ask kind of our questions from before. Anything surprising here? Anything that isn't making sense to you or that you want to note? your understanding of for the group. We can spend a minute here. I see a hand up online, but I think that might be a hand up from before the break. Is that right? Or does somebody online have a question? All right. Okay. We're going to start in the room and assume that the hand up online is from before break. Just let me know if I'm wrong. Yes. Let's get you the microphone so everybody can hear you. It needs a minute. There you go.
One thing that you haven't addressed is the coho population, and several of your retirees that are on the advisory board with me were talking about how resilient the silvers are. Now there's serious numbers of them in rivers upstream of the falls, of Willamette Falls, and those were started by the tribes in their hatch boxes several years ago. According to what we've heard. And now they're everywhere. They're the little North Fork of the Santiam, for example. After the fires, the only fish that were coming up were sockeye. I got silvers. I said the wrong thing. Anyhow, they're definitely a bonus to catch when you're out there. You can catch lots of them at the right time. Do we not have any stocking programs left with silvers?
Thanks, Dennis. Yeah, so we do still have stocking for coho throughout the state, coast, Columbia, and they were included in the analysis. There's a section here on coho, which you can see, and you'll see over time they're kind of variable, but there's no real trend. Pretty sure, Chris. And then really what you're talking about is on kind of the naturally producing fish side of things. We're on the coast. We've seen really good recovery lately, able to provide wild fish fisheries. And then the Willamette, we've got this population that is likely derived from some hatchery outplants in the past. We used to stock in the basin. But now there's no outplanting or no hatchery production of coho in the basin, yet we've still got this self-sustaining wild population that lately has been doing well. And I think that's just a kind of a reflection of coho in general are doing pretty well lately. They seem to be able to exploit some of the nearshore conditions lately to have higher productivity. We're seeing less of those marine heat waves move inshore, so a lot more kind of opportunity for them to do well than some of the other species. Yeah, I think a follow-up from Dennis.
The problem, though, is none of those are clipped. And according to Steve and a few other guys who used to work here or at the other building, they say that the big problem is that fishermen are not using the phones to record their catch. And because of that, there's plenty of fish out there that the feds would easily declassify them, but we have to let them know what the catches are. So they have a weekly count. And if you have a weekly count, then we would reach a certain number that have been caught and then could cut it off. That wouldn't affect the wild population. Is that valid?
We might have to have a follow-up conversation about this because it's very area specific in terms of fisheries management. And I'm not sure, are you talking specifically about Willamette or coast or Lower Columbia? Yeah, I think we'd have to have a follow-up on that. I mean, it doesn't necessarily relate to what we're talking about here in terms of the hatchery program and what it's producing, but if you're interested in talking about the fishery management and how that's set up and how those naturally produced fish are accounted for in managing ESA impacts on Lower Columbia, we can do that.
Yeah, that's true, but as long as the hatchery, as long as they're not being produced in the hatchery, that's true. But if we have only a small number being produced in the hatchery, and we've got all these wild fish that could be qualified for catching, that's just something that, if we're talking about hatcheries, we're talking about getting as many fish out there as possible for the public to catch.
Yeah, I'm not, sorry, I'm not quite sure I'm following here, so I think we should set up something. Thanks.
I see a question in the chat. Emily, do you want to read that?
Sure. Arlen is asking, on the Mackenzie, eWeb plans to remove Leeburg Dam within the next decade. The sorter at the dam is currently critical for keeping hatchery salmon off the wild spawning grounds. What are the plans after that when it appears that there will be no way to maintain that separation?
I guess the plans are very up in the air at the moment. The Leeburg and Mackenzie are both federal facilities, and so it'd be the Corps of Engineers' responsibility to address the ability to provide the mitigation, but also
And I mentioned this at the beginning. We actually have a little bit more information to share, not just the text slide, but some charts and maps as well. So we'll go all the way through the information if that works, Sean, and then we'll talk about it. Okay.
So webinar 3 had two focuses, and in the order we presented, it was really focused on the linker report around the infrastructure first, and then the Four Peaks report, which is around the policy and planning context for hatchery and wildfish. In that report from Four Peaks, again, not too many surprises here, or no surprises from our perspective. Hatchery programs have benefits and risks. There are both state and federal planning and policy frameworks in place. You think of like ESA at the highest level, and in the state it's the wildlife policy, and then on down through like HGMPs and state conservation management plans. There's this big framework set up to ensure that hatcheries are operating in a way that they're being good neighbors to wildfish. And these sideboards are the same sideboards that are going to govern our future system, absent any policy changes at state or federal level. And that's really kind of what is some of the backdrop to the discussion that you all will be having in these small groups, but also that is kind of guiding us as we develop recommendations for what this system is going to look like in the future. Let's just skip to the map. So in terms of the first part of that webinar, where we were talking about some of the vulnerabilities of the system, deferred maintenance, etc. David, I think you have all of this too, like a grainy photo on your phone. Yeah, oh, I see. One of the things that Linker looked at was some of the infrastructure costs here. And this is divided up again into annual operating costs, which are pretty small. And that goes to the question over here earlier, what's the total cost to operate the system? Around 10 million annually. That's in the pink there. Then we've got the deferred maintenance, which is this kind of backlog of maintenance that's built up since these hatcheries have been constructed that hasn't been addressed. In some cases, we have done work. And that's things like raceways that have deteriorated over time, piping, valves, those kind of things. That's in the yellow there. And you can see that for a lot of the state hatcheries, particularly on the coast, that's a large chunk of the infrastructure investments that would need to occur to bring them to a standard, operational standard, or to a standard that we need going forward, I guess. And that deferred maintenance is not just returning it to the way it was, it's putting it into a place that can deal with the vulnerabilities we know are coming. And then there's these kind of projected modifications. You'll see there around 3 or 4 facilities, and those are kind of special case scenarios. Rock Creek is being one of those. Obviously, that was destroyed in the fire. That needs to be fully rebuilt. So it's not, those modifications will need to happen. They're a combination of deferred maintenance that would have had to happen, plus the climate investment. So just decided to have a special category for that. Leeberg, we just talked a little bit about that. A unique circumstance again with the dam coming out. So there's things that would need to happen there. South Sandium. Are, and then the size of the circle indicating the magnitude of investment that would need to happen. So for example, Rock Creek, 45 million. I think, was it Fall River was like 2 million, the cheap, least amount of investment needed. And then the different kind of sectors of the pie illustrating what that money would be going to. Yeah, the question was the insurance money at Rock Creek, does that come out of the 40? And this is just the cost side of things. It doesn't say where the money's coming from to address it. So the state does have, sitting at the moment, 17 million insurance funds for Rock Creek that could be used for that, or it could be used for other things in the system too. And then we're in settlement negotiations with Pacific Power. So not sure what might come out of that. And then there's FEMA funds that could be up to 90% of eligible costs, which again will depend.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate what you're trying to do here. I'm not sure I understand it with so the way I kind of view hatcheries is obviously the concrete and the infrastructure is a different pile of money usually than your annual operating costs, and it's usually a product of the investments that you've made in the past that would result in what it would cost to operate it. So when I think about prioritizing and I think about, the cost-effective analysis that you would do on the utility of each individual hatchery, how did you calculate the annual operating cost? Is that 1 year of cost versus what it would take to, pie in the sky, get each of those hatcheries from an infrastructure need?
Yeah, so the annual operating costs are basically what we're spending right now to operate those facilities, and you can barely see it on the pie chart. It's kind of dwarf.
One year, that's your annual. So,
yeah,
but the
rest
of
it
is like, this is what we need.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So for example, Rock Creek, I think that pink sliver is what, 600,000.
That's helpful. Thank you.
45 million is what you would need to invest. What's that? No, Yeah, the figure out to the side is the total infrastructure cost. So it's adding all those things up. If you want to get just the amount that would need to be invested, you'd have to subtract the annual operating costs out of that. But again, they're so insignificant in these pie charts that you can just think for ballpark figures, that's what it is. Yeah. Yeah. And these are today's costs too. If we're doing this investment in 20 years, it's going to be more. So just keep that in mind.
I think I want to ask and check my understanding with this idea of a one-time cost. That's the cost today, right now, to do what needs to be done with the facility for deferred maintenance modifications if they're needed, and climate and technology and infrastructure upgrades. 20 years from now, that work would cost more, and there would probably be more work because there would still be maintenance that would have accrued over the following 20 years, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There's always maintenance building up. So yeah, you're right. So the question was, do we have new hatcheries to compare this with? You're meaning in terms of construction of a new hatchery? Yeah. The one I'm aware of is down in California. Well, it's not a new hatchery, but the federal government is investing $60 million in a facility in is it the Klamath Basin? Klamath Basin, associated with some of the ongoing work there. That's $60 million to upgrade a hatchery, not to the level that we're talking about here. So, but again, the federal government is a little more expensive than the state. When we're talking like Coal Rivers, for example, the cost of the federal government to do that same work is a lot higher than to the state government. State government is still higher because of all the procurement rules we have to comply with, than a general kind of person would have to bear, but federal government is a lot higher. So we do have some comparables, but short to say that building a hatchery is expensive.
Hey, I've got a hand up online.
Yeah, I just have a quick question.
Oh, one sec, we're just going to finish the question in the room. We'll come right to you.
Great, thanks.
Go ahead and finish your question.
You don't know.
Yeah, the operating costs shown in this diagram are kind of what we're incurring today. If we were to invest in different technology at some of those locations, like chilling and recirculation, we didn't specifically calculate what the change in operating costs would be, but you can think, for example, that some of those things are going to need more maintenance because they're pretty technical and they are going to break down. So that kind of annual operating cost component could go up. Electricity needs are higher, so that could potentially go up, but we are looking to offset a lot of that with solar. So I think in general, in addition to the capital costs, you're likely to see higher operating costs for hatcheries going forward. And that's one of the things that we pointed to earlier as being a tipping point. Our current allocations are not sufficient to keep up with the 14 we've got, and that's why we've had to propose defunding 2 for next biennia. So yes, they're going to increase.
I noticed all the coastal.
One sec, we're going to do the online question and then we'll come back, okay? Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, with respect to the investments that you're projecting there that are needed for deferred maintenance, projected modifications, et cetera, what is the time horizon you're using? For instance, when I make an investment in a new roof, I have a time frame of 30 years or something like that. My roof's going to be good. What is your time horizon here that you're using, that if we make an investment, say in the Trask River or Salmon River or whatever, you know, that capital investment will be, you know, what we need for the next 20 years or 50 years or whatever. I'm looking for a time horizon.
Yeah, and it's really going to depend on which piece of equipment we're talking about. So if it's concrete, typically those have a 20 to 30 year kind of lifespan. But you'll notice that at a lot of our facilities, we've stretched that out really to 40, 50 years just by kind of patching it. So, and then in some of the infrastructure like chilling and recirculation, I think we were looking at, was it, Scott, 20 odd years for that? Was it?
On the chilling and recirculation, I think there's more dependent on how many months that you're actually going to do that. And so I think we were thinking more in the neighborhood of 120 months, whether that's 20 years or 10 years.
Yeah.
Depends on how often it's on.
And part of that, right, is dependent on your ability to service it and maintain it, which again goes back to your annual operating budget. So, yeah, Brian, it's not a straightforward answer. It's going to depend on what piece of equipment you're talking about, but it's going to vary from, say, 10 years up to 30 years, depending on what it is. And that's also going to depend on your ability to service it appropriately during that life period. You could potentially get more out of it or less, depending on how that plays out.
We're going to take a question in the room.
Yes, having moved down from the Tillamook area to the Florence area, I noticed there's no modifications on the west coast at all of the hatcheries, so they must all be really good, huh?
I think what you're seeing there is a lot of yellow, which indicates they need a lot of work on the deferred maintenance side of things. So that's fixing the raceways, water supply valves, etc. And then the blue piece is all that kind of chilling and recirculation shading. So yeah, I wish that was the case.
With the bleach added to their hatchery reservoirs there.
Thanks. I'm going to go, I can see a couple of comments. I'm going to read one of them from Liz. Little confusing to place a one-year operational budget in a pie chart with all non-operational costs that would occur over many years. Maybe just.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. I think hearing this discussion, I would agree with you. Something we could look at taking out in future, but I think just for the purposes of discussion, it's so insignificant in these overall costs that you can really think of those as numbers that, particularly given we're not going to start construction today, almost certainly by the time we get funding and build it, these numbers are going to be higher anyway. So that point taken.
And then we've got a question. Forgive me, I don't have my glasses on. I think that says, Jerry, assuming the hatcheries shown on your map are the worst cases, are the other hatcheries not shown experiencing the same deferred maintenance and projected modifications numbers?
Yeah, so these are not the worst cases. These are just the 14 state hatcheries in their entirety, plus the 3 federal ones that we think could be a part of the state system going forward, or an integral part of operating the state system. The federal facilities, which are not shown, again, in the Columbia Basin, Willamette Basin, there have been assessments done on those, and that's the $1 billion figure I pointed out earlier, which is not just Oregon, it's Oregon, Washington, Idaho, tribal facilities as well. And that's where a lot of the funding recently has been coming in from the federal government to address some of those deferred maintenance, but it's a big lift. I'd say it's similar on the whole, although a lot of those facilities are newer.
Do you have any other questions on infrastructure costs? Okay, let's go to the next set of takeaways. We do have a question in the room. One sec.
Yeah, sorry about that. Backing us up here. So Sean, just candidly speaking, do you anticipate this as kind of a platform for prioritizing where both capital and operating budgets are focused in the future? And the reason I asked that is if that's the case, and I know what you're trying to do, and I got there finally, but the annual operating cost is product of the investment made in the facility already, and those could go down or could go up. And so having that, as a clear tool to pair that with the success or productivity of the fish that are released there and the relative contribution those fish make. But all those pieces I'm guessing, are going to be down the road. We and the agency and the legislature will prioritize the money for the agency, and we'll have to do that exercise at some point. Do you anticipate that?
Yeah, that's really the crux of what this is about. That's what that infrastructure blueprint is about, is saying, where are we going to invest, and where are we not going to invest, and what's that pathway going to look like? And we've asked the legislature for a $20 million capital bond this session, and the outcome of this process with you all and with the tribes is going to dictate where we put that money on the ground first. And then in subsequent years, we'll be kind of going down the list.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So this one is a little difficult to characterize, not to understand, but to characterize what it's really talking about. And so we looked at the infrastructure cost for each facility. This is really looking at how each facility is connected to others in the system, what the excess capacity of that facility is. And by excess capacity, we mean if you made some investments, you could produce more fish there. And that could be a function of you just got space to build more raceways, but it also relies on water. And so where we looked at what our water right is and what the stream flows are, if you applied for more water, you could potentially have it. And that doesn't exist everywhere. It's some unique locations. And then there was other factors that went into this. Again, is this facility located in a kind of underserved area? Is it located in the valley where it's, I guess location came into it. And then fish production, which was a pretty minor component, to be honest, in this analysis, just how many fish are being produced at the facility. And when you look at that, the larger the circle, it just means it's not its importance to the system, but it's more a measure of like its connectivity, potential capacity. So a larger circle you can think of as generally being more important to the system overall than some of the smaller ones. And that's to the system, not to the individual area. And so this is broken up again in each pie chart by the different components of that. So the fish production in purple there, or pink, the excess capacity in gold, and the hatchery connectivity importance. And importance was just a metric of how many different brood stocks do you have at a facility. For example, some of the systems we've got multiple brood stocks being collected at a facility. Summer steelhead, winter steelhead, coho, and it's just difficult to replace that if you don't have that facility there. So yeah, I think the take-homes here, larger circle, more system importance, and more potential capacity. Chris, would you describe it any other way? This is a hard one to get your head around.
No, I think that covers it. The only thing I would add is that some of these hatcheries also have a component to the importance score that has to do with whether they're fulfilling a mitigation requirement or they're linked to some other obligation like the Pacific Salmon Treaty. And so that would also contribute to that hatchery connectivity importance score that's in kind of that purple blue color.
Any questions on that?
Yeah.
What exactly is this excess capacity? Now, and I look at the ALC. Well, you say you have a lot of excess capacity there, but you also say that the ALC is has a decreasing water supply. I don't see its water supply is in trouble. How do you get excess capacity out of that situation?
Yeah, thanks, Carl. So it's a function of a couple of things: space at the facility, and if you have space, you can potentially build additional raceways and additional rearing capacity, and then water. And I think I mentioned that this is excess capacity if you did make investments. And at LC specifically, it has space. But to recognize that additional capacity, you would need to invest in chilling and recirculation to fill that extra capacity. So you're taking the limited water that's there and reusing it many more times.
Well, this chilling is really amazing. Have you ever heard of climate change?
Thanks for that comment.
I was just going to see if there are others.
Anyone else online?
Doesn't look like anyone online right now.
Yeah. So this is where this analysis linker was looking at the vulnerability, climate vulnerability at each hatchery. And they looked at three kind of buckets here, one being water availability, one water quality, and then the blue here, other hazards, thinking fire, sea level rise, et cetera. Water availability and water quantity are the two big ones for our facilities, but don't, I think, discard the other hazards in terms of fire. As we're finding out, if you lose a facility, it can take many years to get that back online. And so those fire risks are real. This year we had 2 facilities evacuated on the east side. Every year now we're getting evacuations or impacts. And so I think it's inevitable at some point that one of these locations will burn. So again, the bigger the circle, the more resilient a hatchery is. So it's got either good water, or water, and you see a lot of that is in the valley, and a lot of that is associated with reservoirs from the Army Corps, or down in Rogue Creek where you've got, the Rogue River where you've got Lost Creek Reservoir. The coastal facilities tended to be more vulnerable, less resilient, and again, a lot of that's linked to water quality and water temperature. I think those are the main take-homes there. Can't read.
I'll try. We do have a question online, or maybe a couple actually, from Liz. How much excess capacity do we need in Oregon to ensure that we have backup facilities during power outages, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a good question, Liz. It really is going to depend on how widespread some of those outages are. In the current system, we currently don't have Mackenzie, to some extent Leeburg or Rock Creek functioning, and we don't have a Klamath Hatch House, and we've been able to absorb that production into the remaining system. Going forward, it's going to depend on whether you have that kind of magnitude of outages and where they're located, because some systems like Coal Rivers, for example, are so integral to the system that if you lost that, you'd be really struggling to spread that capacity out to other systems. So it's a bit of a hard question to answer, because it's going to depend on which hatchery is affected and how many of them. That's one of the things we're looking at here, is providing capacity to be able to deal with these things that we know are going to happen.
All right, it looks like we have another question in the chat. Do these system importance scores incorporate adaptability of facilities to potential needed changes in the system, for instance, to change from producing coho to trout or vice versa?
I'm pretty sure they don't, no. And I don't know if Scott or someone wants to weigh in. I mean, I think what we're really trying to achieve here is a system that can produce whatever our need of the day is. And that's really dependent on our ability to supply cool, clean water. You can rear, if you have that, you can rear trout, you can rear coho, you can rear whatever species you need to rear. And that's just not the case at some of our facilities currently. Would that be fair, Scott?
I know these are a lot to take in, and you will have access to them. Does anybody have questions on this before I think we have one more, maybe not. Let's see. Oh, we do.
I think that's just
The combined, yeah, do you want to explain what that is? Just leave it.
This is really just putting those three assessments together, the climate resilience, system contribution, and infrastructure costs. So it's just kind of a roll-up of everything we've seen to date. I guess.
We have a question in the room.
We have all this money to put in the hatcheries, and all we're doing, we're feeding the seals and the cormorants. Is there any chance that we could maybe help the predator problem?
You're really stretching things today. Yeah, I think it's certainly not really part of what we're looking at as part of this process, but that is something the department thinks about in terms of, one, when we're developing these plans, we're looking at the impact of predation on both wild and hatchery stocks. And in some locations, we're taking actions like the Columbia Basin, where there's work going on around avian and pinniped and piscine predation. A lot less, or really no work on predator control on the coast. But also, we don't have the evidence that we would need to dive into, say, pinniped control on the coast, understanding that just kind of the framework around that and not knowing that it's having a population level effect. So probably not a great answer, but not something we're considering here. And it's a difficult kind of field you get into because there's so many, the food web interactions are so complex that it might look like they're having an impact. You know, you see them eating salmon, but they're also eating predators of salmon. And so those kind of interactions in a coastal environment are really complex, and we don't necessarily have the information we'd need to say, yes, it needs managing, or no, it doesn't. We do have a lot of information, or building information, on avian cormorants terns on the coast. And we've actually seen declines in a lot of those populations over time. We've seen concentrations up into the Columbia Basin. So there are things going on, but this is kind of a topic for another day.
Looks like we've got a question in the chat from Anne.
Great.
Do these climate resilience scores apply just to hatcheries or also to river habitats that produce wild fish?
These scores just apply to the hatcheries themselves, but part of the score is wrapped up in the water availability and water quality, which is coming from the rivers. So if a river is decreasing in flows over time, that's going to be a more of a vulnerability for the hatchery, but also a vulnerability for the wild fish. And likewise with temperatures, if they're going up, it's a vulnerability for the hatchery, but also for the wild fish. And so that's, you don't see it for the whole riverscape here, but that's the information that went into calculating it for the hatchery.
And it looks like we have another question in chat. How does this hatchery evaluation process fit with upcoming assessment of coastal multi-species management plan, of the coastal multi-species management plan?
So this hatchery system has been around for over 100 years, and it's lived through multiple different plans. And we envision it's going to live through multiple future iterations of plans. And so what we're really trying to keep the discussion on here is putting in place a system that can deliver whatever the need of the day is. It might be the CMP, or it might be whatever plan is in place in 10 years or 20 years. And so those planning processes will still occur, and the outcomes of those will drive how we use the infrastructure we have on the day. So they're connected, but they're this is not necessarily driving the outcome of the CMP.
Do we have any other questions? There was a request to check out this slide. Anyone online have any questions? Or in the room? Oh, we have a question in the room from David. I think if you can.
Thank you. I think that predator question is an interesting one. There's plenty of evidence that shows that hatchery practices in terms of releases and returns actually act as an attractor to predators because the fish are going out in a very short period of time or in large numbers. And if we're thinking about trying to get the productivity of fish you're raising, it seems like this assessment should be thinking about infrastructure that may allow changes in practices to avoid the predation effects. And that we can keep, and the other way to look at this is we can keep raising tons of fish, releasing them all at once, and then trying to focus on the predators, whether they're birds, fish, or mammals. A lot of the reasons that the predators are very effective is because there's a lot of man-made structure in the environment. It's been modified, perfect place to rest, hunt, and digest. And it seems like we need to think about how these things factor in to this. I mean, we're looking at your infrastructure, but maybe we need to be constructing the future hatchery differently so we can allow fish to go out at a less intense in terms of amount and frequency to avoid the predator attraction issues. And I'm wondering if that is something that either has been looked at, if any of the consultants have studied that, or how the department if the department's looked at that, what kind of things are going to factor into how much that might cost in the future. Is that part of the future? I guess it was under the blue part of that. Anyways, that was a rambling question, but I think it's important to not ignore the issue here.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I don't think we're really talking about ignoring the predator issue, but it's a case of what we're trying to achieve here versus what we're trying to achieve with management of these stocks overall. And that piece is kind of like I alluded to before, we've evolved in our kind of planning over time. Currently, we're under, for example, this coastal multi-species plan, Rogue South Coast plan on the coast. And those plans identify the limiting factors for each population. One of the limiting factors they look at is whether predation from birds, mammals, or fish is a limiting factor. And we really just, with a few exceptions, we don't have a lot of evidence that that is a limiting factor for a lot of the wild populations. But that is the question that will continue to get asked and answered in that forum. And what we're talking about here, and in that forum, you do look at adjustments to hatchery practices if you think they are having an impact on the wild fish, whether it's release strategy or timing or the release number. And that will continue to happen. What we're talking about here is putting in place infrastructure that can be flexible to whatever the outcomes of that is, because we can't predict it everywhere and through time. We know it's just going to change, and you'll need a system that can be flexible to that.
Any other questions? Mm-hmm. 1 sec, we're going to get to the mic. Yeah.
At the combined assessment up here, how are you going to incorporate some of the tribe conversations into this? Is it going to be kind of overlaid over top of this eventually, or understand some of their priorities? Because I know it's a little bit separate process than this. Just to understand how that may factor into some of the decisions once we get in the small group, have that understanding too.
Yeah, and I think Teresa kind of laid it out well. The three kind of things the department is working with here. There's we've got government to government consultation with the tribes. where we're going to hear their perspectives on what their needs are for the system, the value of the system, and what they'd like to see happen. We've got working with you all in the small group. We're going to dive into that soon, but that's where we're looking for any alignment and what investments need to be made in the system going forward. And then there's the department's own analysis of all of this information and what we might think makes sense. And we're going to have to meld all of those things together in the end to get a blueprint. How that happens, I don't necessarily know yet. To some extent, it's going to depend on the alignment between the three different parts of that assessment.
We've got a comment in the chat. From
Okay,
Brian.
we're gonna do one quick question and then we'll come to the comment.
Okay, this is Jennifer with Native Fish Society. If we're chatting through a scenario that's a consolidated facility system, fewer facilities across the landscape, but perhaps still operating programs in rivers where then we would need acclimation facilities, trap facilities. Will the department kind of have any maybe ballpark numbers of like what that kind of infrastructural changeover would cost, just so that we could include that in our kind of discussions going forward?
Yeah, those are things that we can at a high level pull together. Yeah, and we've done some kind of scenarios like that just to see what it would look like, but there's so many you could do that we just decided not to include it here. But certainly for the discussions, if that's where people are wanting to go to, we can provide information that can help with that conversation. Was there something online?
All right, we have one comment. Do you want to read that for us, Emily?
Sure. Brian just wanted to note the existence and availability of hatchery facilities combined with hatchery reform practices favoring use of in-basin stocks and rearing most definitely impacts management plans. Management plans in turn impact the use of hatchery facilities as well. They go hand in hand.
Thank you for that. You're getting some head nods in the room. Any other questions before we advance here in our conversation? Okay. Sorry, Sean's running away. One more thing. I think you all wanted to make a comment just about alternatives that were presented.
Yeah, thanks for that reminder. So to Jennifer's point here, where one of the things that could be considered is consolidation of production into fewer facilities, which depending on how you do it, could require that you have different kinds of infrastructure for collection acclimation, or it could mean that you're just having different kinds of programs. There's a lot of different things, kind of what if scenarios that could be talked through here. But we just wanted to understand what that might look like in terms of capital, and we did want to understand that in terms of annual operating costs, but we haven't quite got there with the contractor. So we asked them to assess really two alternatives, but there's three parts to the second alternative. One was just all those upgrades you saw earlier on the pie graphs. What would it cost to put those in at all existing facilities, all 14? And then the second alternative is where we did that consolidation. So in the Southwest, I'm just going to start there because it's easiest. That was where the same scenario in each of these alternative A2A, 2B, 2C, and that was to close Rock Creek and then expand out at Elk River and Bandon, so adding additional capacity at those facilities. In the Deschutes Basin, it was talking about upgrading at Oak Springs and Fall River. And that would be two facilities that could then take trout production out of the west side of the state, put it over there, and that frees up space in the west side for an edgemus species. And then northwest, there was just three alternatives, which was one, closing the Halem and upgrading Cedar and LC, so having additional capacity at those facilities for the production that was at LC. Largely, some of that production at Nehalem could go also into the valley. The other option was to close Salmon River, upgrade Cedar and Nehalem, and then the third was to close LC and upgrade Cedar and Nehalem. Oh. Okay, sorry, I thought there was a slide here that just showed the outcomes of that analysis. Essentially, for alternative 2A, you were looking at around, I think, $7 million capital savings. You know, if you think of, say, 220 million was the total cost in alternative 1, alternative 2A was about 7 million cheaper. Alternative 2B, I think it was around 10, and alternative 2C was around 15, and there was some error bars around that. So some savings can be had in the total investment by consolidation. But again, we got to, you know, the trade-offs to all of this too. By consolidating, you're exposing additional risks. And there may be some, may or may not be savings in annual operating costs, depending on whether you have to have some of that collection acclimation facilities out there. So this was a start on some information that could inform some of the discussions you're going to have about what consolidation might look like and where savings may or may not be.
Thanks, Sean. We have a question in the room. One sec.
Some of the upgrade costs, do you factor in some of ways to mitigate the risk? Obviously, if you're going to consolidate, like you say, you are increasing some risk. Are there things, and this goes into some of the questions earlier, like, you know, backup power, or, you know, figuring out how to make it so it's less or burn up in a fire, those kinds of things. Are those all factored into that? Or is it just really just the facility?
Well, so all of the construction that we've been talking about is intended to be more resilient. So you're talking about, rather than building with combustible materials, building with non-combustibles, backup power, solar power, plus generator. So yes, to some extent, but the big risk is always fire, and that's a hard one to kind of control in some of these areas.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, just for clarification, when you talk about these alternatives, you're talking about production neutral, right? Just to be clear.
Yeah. Yes, there's, like, you know, within a
nothing gets
1,000
communities
pounds
more riled up than, you know, our hatcheries on the Tropping Block have 30 years of experience dealing with many budgets that had hatcheries on them that were earmarked for closure, and I don't remember any that were closed. It's just the problem is the agencies take the hit, right? The budget comes from somewhere.
Yeah, all of these scenarios, and Scott and Chris can confirm, assume that we're maintaining the same programs we have today, just doing it in different ways. It does become more or less challenging depending on what you're talking about here.
Let's go online. I see a couple of hands, maybe.
Leonard?
Yes. Larry Phillips, thank you for that. That was the first of my two-part question. Great question. My other question is, with these three alternatives that has come to mind, does Oregon compare with any other states or even countries? You know, what might be the best fit for this? How are others doing it, or is this strictly in Oregon?
Thanks, Leonard. I mean, this look is strictly in Oregon. Other states and the federal government are taking their own looks, using various approaches. I think Washington they have pretty strong legislative support and investment in their system. And so they're kind of taking a stepwise approach of trying to incorporate recirculation in a lot of their facilities. We're kind of on the front line of some of the changing climate impacts relative to Washington. And so they're not necessarily in the same boat for needing a lot of chilling as we might be. But they're taking that approach. They haven't, as far as I'm aware, looked at systematically at their system and had this kind of conversation. The federal government has had various looks, both nationwide at 4 facilities, I think. And then on the West Coast, they've looked at, the West Coast Fish and Wildlife Service has looked at all their facilities and developed kind of a needs assessment for each of those. And again, they're in the same boat we are. A lot of their facilities are really struggling and are going to need significant investment that currently isn't there. Not aware of anything else kind of like what we're doing.
Thank you.
Steve, Godin?
Thank you. Well, I can understand how you could be production neutral, spreading all the various different fish amongst the hatcheries. The one that bothers me the most is in the southwest on this chart. Closing the Rock Creek Hatchery is tantamount on all three alternatives except for alternative one. And when you close Rock Creek, then the only fisheries that are available to anglers on the Umpqua River that are supported by the hatcheries are, in one case, winter steelhead, is the only winter steelhead you can keep are hatchery fish. And number two are springers, or spring run Chinook salmon, of which at least this year and in past years, the only fish you could keep were hatchery fish. So I'm hoping that when you close, which seems obvious, the Rock Creek Hatchery for good, that the plans are to sustain those fisheries somehow, whether you trap them someplace other than Rock Creek or in other creeks that can provide stock, that stock could be reared in Bandon or Elk River or wherever, and then acclimated and released in the Umpqua for anglers to fish for. And there'll be a lot of people disappointed if we don't do that. So I wanted to make that point clear. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and Umpqua is on our mind a lot, just not only Rock Creek, but just the challenges of that are going on in that basin. And so point well taken. It's something that we're thinking about a lot, and I'm sure the group will be discussing as well.
I think we have one more hand online, Brian.
Yeah, and again, a question for Sean. You know, all of these hatchery discussions, it reminds me of the old saying that, you know, all politics is local. So this is an example that's local to me, but I think it applies to some of the other questions you've already got. Under alternative 2, you've got close the Nehalem hatchery. And I'm wondering if you've done an evaluation of the feasibility of maintaining production neutral, as you've indicated, and how that would work if you've closed these facilities, and would it work in the ESA context and approvals from NOAA that are required for that. And the reason I'm asking is obviously coho are ESA listed. You've got a coho program in the Nehalem. If that hatchery is closed, how are you going to maintain on a program neutral basis the production in the Nehalem by using facilities that are out of basin? And will the National Marine Fisheries Service approve something like that? Because it seems to me there's been a move in recent years, in decades actually, to not be transferring stocks around basins, for various reasons, including disease, et cetera. So I'm just wondering if you've evaluated all those scenarios and are able to say, yeah, by closing the Nehalem, or another example, you can maintain production neutrality, I guess is the word you were using.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And we haven't got that in depth yet on those kind of questions because we don't necessarily know. We don't want to explore all scenarios. We want to see kind of where our consultations with the tribes land, where input from the public and where that alignment might be. And then we're going to look at this data ourselves and draw our own conclusions from it. And until we're kind of through a lot of that process, we're not going to spend a lot of capacity drawing out every conceivable scenario here. But you bring up some of the important questions there'll be we'll have to think about, as, for example, a small group might ask a question that you just asked, and depending on where, how strong that alignment would be, we would then go away and think about that and ask some of those questions and try and answer them. But we really are building this with you all at the moment, and so we don't have all those answers right now.
Nice.
Right, I've got.
Okay. We're going to do a couple in the room and then I'll come back to your question, Anne.
All right, this is Jennifer. I think you kind of answered my question, which is, this isn't a comprehensive look at the world of possibilities, but I was just wondering why, if there's a reason you hadn't included expanding one of the federal facilities in this look in particular, or you were just kind of trying to get a real general idea of cost savings with a few different ideas.
Well, I think these to some extent do assume that investments are going to be made at those federal facilities. For example, Coal Rivers, there's investments underway at the moment that, if they're seen to completion, would be able to play a role in this kind of Southwest scenario. And Leeburg, the kind of what you've seen earlier in terms of that, what was it, 30 odd million, if that was invested there, and that all played out, a lot of what ifs there, but that would then support this system as well. So it is accounting for those, but this is more on top of all those things that you've seen previously. We didn't, for example, propose adding more raceways at Bandon or Elk. This could do that. Chris?
Yeah, just to add to that, one of the other reasons when we were developing these scenarios is we wanted to have things that, when we were thinking through it, some of the options around expanding production into the federal facilities or even the future of a place like Leeburg was so uncertain that we felt like it was a little bit kind of going out over our skis to be able to, if you go and you assume that, okay, we're going to be able to move all this production into a federal facility and you're using that as your basis of your scenario, that might end up sounding really good, but not being feasible in the long term. So we wanted to come up with solutions that were actually things that could feasibly be implemented when we were thinking about these scenarios, even though there is a lot of details in here that would be difficult to work out and remaining questions, they're still kind of in that realm of things we have more control over.
Let's take one more question in the room and then I'll ask the question online. Sure. Then we'll come to you next.
This is Dennis from the STEP program in Florence. We rely on hatcheries to take our steelhead eggs we harvest, and we harvest several 100,000, send them on. We get 90,000 smolt back, and the rest are distributed statewide as trout into the lakes and streams. So we need the hatchery programs. I think they go to LC and then maybe they're raised to smolt to roaring rivers. I think that's where they go. But our next concern is, well, first of all, there'd be no steelhead on the Siuslaw River, because when we're running our trap, we had about 1,400 new fish come into our trap this year. 1 out of 100 were unclipped. The rest of them were all clipped. And we take those unclipped and we put them immediately upstream from our trap. They're never touched. We're very careful about that. But our next concern is, used to be Chinook were 2 and 20 on the river, 20 for the season, 2 a day. Then it went down to 1 and 10. I think there was a year we had none. Last year, I think it was 1 per season. This year, it's 1 per day, 2 for the season. We need hatcheries in the future because we're talking with our local tribes to try and set up a Chinook program. We're going to need a way to obtain eggs and then somewhere have them raised, and that would potentially be a hatchery. There's nothing being done for Chinook on the Siuslaw River. A lot of these other rivers have programs, but we need hatcheries probably in our future to get there.
I'm going to do this and I'll come here. Thank you. Anne has a question. I think it says, Anne, online. Can you say more about the need to chill water to address climate change stresses moving forward? Do you know yet how much additional energy that new technology will require?
Yeah, so one of the contracts we let Anne was to a company called Solarc, who's got a lot of experience in this kind of technology, has installed it at some hatchery facilities. And so they in their report, you'll see a calculation of power draw, energy costs, etc. So we do have a pretty good idea of that. One of our goals with the system also is to be carbon neutral. I think if you recall, agency has a policy to be carbon neutral by 2050. And so we don't want to certainly add to that burden here. Our stocks are already getting impacted by changing climate, and we don't want to be a part of that problem. So Solarc also has a lot of experience with offsetting the energy draw by putting in solar. And so for all of these facilities where we're proposing chilling, there's also solar going in to propose to offset that carbon impact. So that'll all be in the report, and I don't have the specific details.
Yeah, question for Sean on the alternatives. Doesn't Lieberg have to be on the upgrade, given that in the future there's decisions that you're not in control of, given the dam, and so it almost needs, that has to be part of this plan. Otherwise, you can get to that point and then have the rug pulled out from under us on Lieberg unless it's established a water source and part of an upgrade system.
Yeah, it's certainly really important. But to Chris's point, because we don't necessarily control that, we have input with the Corps of Engineers, but it's their facility. We didn't want to assess it as hey, here's something we can definitely do that could meet this need. But it's in the background of our minds that it could potentially be a very important component of the system. Of course, the Corps could look at this and say, if they take a system look in the Willamette, they may be able to meet that capacity need elsewhere, not Lieberg. It may be that when they do their assessment of Lieberg and Mackenzie, they say, well, rather than doing it here, we're going to do it over here. And we just don't know that yet. That's something they need to do.
Thank you.
I'm seeing some shifting here in the room and thinking we might need a break. It's actually a little chilly. We might need some jumping jacks as well. Do you have any more questions? Brian, is your hand up again, or was that from before?
Sorry, that was from before. I'll take it down.
Okay, great. Thanks. Any other questions to close out our webinar review, and then we'll charge ahead with what's next. We have one question in the room. He's ready to close us out.
Are all of these charts and stuff in the webinar number 3 information?
Some of them are, and the maps that we were going through with the pies on them, those are available in the materials for this meeting.
Oh, for this meeting, okay. Not for webinar 3 then.
No, those were created. We were sort of playing with depicting that information across the map instead of in the bars. Yep.
Thank you.
We have one more question. Hold on one sec, please. Hold on one sec, please. Let's get the microphone to you.
This is sort of a question and a request. This Larry fellow, I think on the technical meetings said that 800,000 people fished in Oregon, and I think that's high. So my request is how many people that you should provide the number of how many people, actual people, fish per anadromous fish in this state. I did a estimate myself. It's probably around 300,000, but it could be as high as 350,000. But you can certainly provide an accurate number.
Sure, we can do that.
Thanks. Why don't we take 10 minutes to stretch out for, excuse me, for folks online. We'll be back here at 2 o'clock, and we'll talk to you then.
I appreciate you bringing that up, and you're right. It is something worth.
On the data, the idea here is that the public group, this larger group, and with the effort of the smaller group, are going to create, I'm going to call it guidance, but not in the legal sense guidance, but advice, guidance, direction to the department on where you think the department should be focusing its efforts for investment and where the department maybe could pull back on its investments. So how should it direct its money? What kinds of considerations should the department take into account? And what I had done for the folks online is just ask, are people starting to develop ideas about what that would look like? Or even just what it should contain. Like, I definitely want to tell the department about X. I definitely want to make sure that it looks like Y. Does anybody have any ideas yet? Online or in the room? All right, we have one in the room. We're going to try to use the mic. And if you can hold the mic up nice and close, that'll
Sure.
help them hear.
Glad
Yeah.
to do that. I think the most important part is who's our audience?
Mhm.
Who are we speaking to? Because it's going to become a financial decision,
Yeah.
either through the legislature or through the agency. So for me, it's how do I communicate this information
Mhm.
to the parties that have a vested interest in either funding it or implementing it. So that's the suggestion, I guess. And how do
Okay.
we do that on a broad scale? Because as I know Larry knows and I know that not all the people in Oregon fish,
Mhm.
but all the people in Oregon, and there's many surveys that say this, they want fish in their local streams or in the rivers because that's the canary in the coal mine is that they have fish in their streams and that they can see them or access them if they want to.
Mhm. So a focus on the audience is important. Was that a question about who the audience will be, or sort of a rhetorical, let's keep in mind who the audience is?
No, I think it's a let's keep in mind who
Okay.
our audience is because we're all passionate all about
Mhm.
fishing and that part of it. And the general public doesn't have that same level of information um, or passion for those issues.
Yep. Yep.
Also, I'll just make one more point that I want. These
Mhm.
hatcheries and the hatcheries around the state are tourist destinations.
Mm-hmm.
They need to become an entity that is part of the community, and that the community, I know in Florence, I know this, and Coos Bay, I know it. The communities all know what those hatcheries do and the revenue that it provides for those communities.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to take that model and make it so that these hatcheries become somewhat tourist destinations. And we hope it doesn't happen, that they're going there to see the only fish that's left.
Yeah.
And so that's where I see us changing the paradigm of how do we make sure these hatcheries benefit not only the angling community, but also the general public as a resource.
And will you share your name and organization real quick? Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm Tom Vanderplaat. I have a long history of
Mm-hmm.
volunteering for ODFW, mostly through the Association of Northwest Steelheaders.
Great.
That's part of that. I'm
Thanks.
also on the Restoration Enhancement Board right now.
Great. And for everyone in the room, when you speak, we have a request for you to give your name so that people online know who's talking. They can't really see. Other thoughts or reactions online or in the room? Oh, I see a hand. Steve, go ahead.
Hi, this is Steve Godin. I'm the president of the Oregon Coast Anglers. And, I've listened to all of the webinars and participated in all of the meetings so far and hope to continue. And I think it's important that we look at, one, where we are, perhaps where we've been in view of the decline in the fisheries, and that as we look forward, that we accommodate everything that we should have. And when I say should have, I mean what was there before that will continue on as we go forward. And as I've mentioned on the Elk River, I'm particularly concerned about the spring run Chinook salmon. There may be other subspecies, if I can call them that, on other rivers that I'm not aware of. But I think they all need consideration in the plan that we come up with. And I think there also needs to be better linkage with the STEP programs, because they in many ways facilitate what ODFW is trying to achieve through volunteer effort, which costs in the ODFW next to nothing, and involves the communities and provides and helps enhances support for all the things we're trying to do. So I hope to be an asset as you go forward with that small working group and trying to make these things happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Leonard?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. That's a great point made about STEP in particular. I appreciate Tom's comments also, but to address that first bullet, understand how public process and work product fits into legislative, tribal, and agency work. I think many of us can identify with our tribal friends in that, harvest and having salmon in the rivers is very important to our culture. And we're all born with that same type of DNA within us. The generations before me or us were fishing and trying to promote fish in the streams and conservation. And once again, our recreational harvests in particular is the gateway to conservation. That's what pays for conservation. So I think I'm very happy with the agency putting that message forth. That's conservation, it's culture, and economics. They're very, very vital to Oregon. So hopefully we can put that message forth as a collective group to our legislators.
Thank you, Leonard. Anybody in the room have similar perspective? Yes, let me get you the mic here.
Yeah, thanks. Seth White, Oregon Hatchery Research Center. I want to speak to the third bullet there, identify opportunities about the work product. Full disclosure, I get part of my salary through ODFW. But speaking from the university side, there are going to be information gaps that come up. Their research typically has a history of being, in-depth people with lab coats with beakers studying highly mechanistic things. But at OHRC, we're really trying to cater the work that we do to be more directly applicable to management actions that are both increasing harvest but also protecting wild fish genetics and ecology. So if along the way the small group or the large group can identify what those information gaps are, that would be really useful to us to make sure research that we do can serve this process.
Thank you. Were you going to speak? Yep. There you go.
Yeah, thank you. Larry Phillips, American Sportfish Association. Unfortunately, we're in this dilemma. I wish that the support through the legislature had provided with Oregon with the tools and resources it needed to keep up with hatchery infrastructure. And this is going to be. I'm looking forward to the conversations to come. But again, I hope that the takeaway here is that we collectively advocate for the funds that are needed. I also think that a parallel investment needs to continue to happen in this understanding or creating the sideboards around how we operate hatcheries. I mentioned it earlier. In the absence of clear, defined sideboards on where it is appropriate and where we have opportunity to expand hatchery production, or we should be developing a different options. I think that's critical. And if in the absence of that, the conversations become emotional, and that's where it gets challenging for all of us. So again, look forward to this conversation. I appreciate Seth's comments about continuing the adaptive management process has to be part of this. We're learning, on the fly now about the new sciences and new approaches. So yeah, it's a complicated process. Thank you.
Thanks. Anybody online have any thoughts? And then I'll come back into the room. Okay. David, did you have a comment? Mm-hmm.
This is David Moskowitz with Conservation Angler. And in terms of this blueprint, that's definitely how we see this process. It took 150 years of hatchery development to get us where we are today. And the concrete is crumbling, the rebar is rusting, the stainless steel is not stainless anymore. And we have climate change on top of that. We have recovery plans for many of the depressed species. And they all say that if we take the actions in the recovery plans that have been adopted, you look at the Columbia Basin Collaborative or any of these efforts, if we do everything, in 100 years, we'll have wild fish recovered to healthy, harvestable levels. That's the goal of like the Columbia Basin Partnership Task Force, which has been widely accepted. So the corollary to that is if we're going to have healthy, harvestable wild fish in 100 years, then that means we don't necessarily need the hatchery system, right? So we see this blueprint as a way to get at that bigger goal, so that actually you don't have to have a bunch of volunteers marking hatchery fish, because there's enough wild fish to support harvest. That's the 100-year goal. Now, I'm hoping to be around then, but I'm not sure we'll all be there then. But in any case, our kids are going to be there, and their kids, and we see this as a really important step. And everybody in this room and the people who are going to be in the work group, we have a chance to really have Oregon lead the charge here. And I think that's why we're very supportive of this process, because it's a process that it's scientific, it's economic, it's involves the public, And that's different than what the Fish and Wildlife Service is doing on their review. It's different than what Washington is doing. No one else is doing this. So this is the Oregon way. We should all be really proud of being where we are today, trying to chart this course. So, but it's not going to be easy. And I think all of us are going to have to really come to grips with sort of, maybe for lack of a better term, sort of the limits to growth, especially with climate change affecting the cold, clear water, which is what we need to produce these fish, whether you're at Oak Springs or whether you're at Salmon River. So we have a big job right ahead of us to build this blueprint. And we need to make sure that I think I'm triggered a little bit by Larry's comment about it's going to get emotional, and that makes it harder to make a decision. We all have these very strong beliefs that hatchery wild issues they're like political issues. They are emotional, but there is a lot of information out there about what these fish need and what works and what doesn't. And this is our chance to try to get the legislature to buy in as a first step. So we're talking what, $20 million is what you've asked for in the pot for the next 2 years. And I think the price tag is much higher than that. And there needs to be a sustained effort. And if all of us can kind of come to agreement, we might be able to get the legislature, and Sean can tell us more about that. But they have short attention spans, a lot of the people just up the street here. We're going to need to really have a solid plan and try to come together with some unity to get there. And we're going to all have to swallow a few things to get there, or it's going to be a battle right up in the Capitol, right starting in January or even sooner. So sort of a challenge, but we're excited to be here. And I think we all need to really, buy into this because it's really an important process.
Thanks, David. I'll ask again, anyone online? Have any thoughts?
Just wanted to include Liz's comment in the chat. She notes the Columbia Basin Partnership goals include hatchery abundance goals.
Thank you. Any other comments in the room about sort of driving back to our original question? I'm hearing some considerations for the group, maybe some principles or shared vision for the group. Anybody have sort of thoughts about, there have been several references to this as a complex process with a lot of moving pieces. We're considering economics at the same time we're considering conservation, at the same time we're considering culture. Does anybody having any thoughts yet about how to sort of work with all of these moving pieces and communicate back to the department in a way that is sort of helpful to guide their decision making? I see Leonard has his hand up. Do you have all the answers, Leonard? I'm hoping.
I don't have all the answers, but I have a lot of questions.
Okay, let's hear it.
No, I know. I think there's a lot of us that feel that don't feel. We know that having central hatcheries, and I think the agency agrees with this to a point too, but something to look at. Central hatcheries with smaller facilities, maybe hatching and rearing facilities, acclimation sites, whatnot. Choose those in climate happy ecosystems. Basically, we have a lot of cold water in Oregon. A lot of our hatcheries sites were placed there for a lot of different reasons, and they weren't put there maybe because they were an optimum location for fish. They were there for political reasons, but there's a lot of small sites that are perfectly applicable, would rear fish well, especially if we engage the community like we do with the Salmon Trout Enhancement Program and private partnerships to help fund and drive these things. We could take this a long ways with that, a long ways further even, I think.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, there's one loose end here that I'm a little concerned about is, there's, I guess, going to be some other discussions separate from this with the tribes. And I wonder if the tribal input would have some impact on how the small group and the rest of us might think as those kinds of discussions take place. So is there a way in this process that you loop back so that information becomes available?
I'm gonna let the department, do you want to come over here?
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and this question's come up a few times, and we don't have all the answers yet on this. There are going to be concurrent processes, and there are 9 tribes, so it's going to be a lot of September and October are going to be pretty busy for Chris and I. And to the extent that we can, we'll be checking back in with you all, but keeping in mind that these are government-to-government conversations, and so our ability to do that is dependent on, the kind of where those conversations are landing and the willingness to share outside of that consultation at this point. So it's a bit of a TBD on some of this stuff, and we'll just play it by ear, but we'll keep everyone in the loop to the extent we can on where things are going.
All right. Well, it just seems that it's quite conceivable that some of the discussions going on with the tribes and others could trump the work that's going on with a small group. And, I don't think any of us want to see anybody spin their wheels unnecessarily. So I'm hoping that as part of how this unfolds, that you can at least advise on directions that may be appropriate or inappropriate. Thank you.
Yeah, and I've said this a couple of times, but point well taken. But certainly we're consulting as government to government with the tribes, but the work we're doing with you all is really important too, for some of the reasons David just pointed out, that we're ultimately going to need legislative support to build this, and that's going to depend on the ability of you all to align and support this. So I think there's these relationships and the ability to stay together are going to be really important across tribes and across the public and you all. So it's not like we're saying anyone trumps anyone at the moment. It's just we're going to have these different conversations, and hopefully we can all get to a place where there's alignment. And I think there are probably places where we can. And where there aren't, we're just going to have to make some decisions about how we go forward. And to the extent we can, we'll be trying to work across those two processes and see where we can land. But it's not just our decision in this case. So.
Thanks, Sean. I see a question online I want to go to because it's sort of similar about the flow of information. Anne asks, will there be an opportunity to provide additional input after the actual reports are made public, or will everything need to go through small groups? I have thoughts.
Yeah, we've really been kind of building this as we go in terms of how the larger group could also weigh in on the small group discussions and then potentially afterwards. And depending on how things go, we may have additional outreach to the larger group in terms of potentially surveys that go beyond people here today, but more broadly to the public. We're just not sure at this stage. It will kind of depend on where we're landing. But ultimately, there's obviously opportunities for the public to weigh in with the legislature next year. And then this isn't a switch we're hitting either. This is a pathway for the next 20 odd years. And so there'll be plenty of opportunity to weigh in. But really, we're looking to see what kind of alignment we can get right now at this moment in time to implement that pathway. And we'll be looking to provide as many opportunities as possible for you all to weigh in during this time.
And I just want to share from Willamette Partnership's perspective, because our role is to sort of hold the process and sort of obviously help facilitate it, but also come up with design ideas. Um, the flow of information is one of the primary issues that we are thinking about and talking about. And so we are always sort of paying attention to whether or not there's a topic that everybody would benefit from hearing discussion on. And so, for example, if there was something to talk about with reports where everybody would benefit, maybe there would be a small group meeting that's happening already, and a piece of that would be available through link for people to hear what's happening if we're going to talk about reports or something like that. So I'm not sure that's going to unfold exactly as I described, but we're constantly thinking about ways to communicate so that everybody has an opportunity to help the department reach that goal, because they've made very clear that they want as much input as they can get through this process, even though it's a tight timeline. Any other questions? I think we're sort of getting into the concerns about the work product section, or concerns about how it will be used or what the department will do with it. Any other concerns that folks have they want to talk about? No. Any other ideas? We had asked sort of a big, broad question. Any other ideas or ways of thinking people want to share about how to, what this work product might look like? Yeah. Tom, you do need a microphone unless you want to yell really loud.
So I'm one of the old guys, right? What I'm concerned about is how does the process of social media come into play in this process? Because if you're not telling your story, somebody else is. So I guess I'm asking the department and the Willamette Partnership, how are you, is there a plan to somewhat manage that? Because it's a huge element now to kind of the culture of decision making as part of that process. So I just want to throw that out to you. That to me is somewhat, I think, a pretty significant challenge as I've watched it progress. I won't say mature, progress over the years. And so I just want to put that out there, that social media and the computer generated information and those kind of things I'm hoping that the building of relationships helps, but that is one element that can be really challenging from my perspective. So I just want to say that.
I appreciate that comment. I think it's one for us to talk about. We've had the benefit of working with the department's public information officer who's helping with this project, but we haven't gotten to social media. We've just been focused on trying to communicate facts about the fact that we're meeting. So we can chat about that. Thanks for the note. Oh, Sean has thoughts about social media.
Yeah, I am not actually on any social media for good reasons. Emma? There you go. Yeah. I take great pains to avoid ever seeing myself online. But Tom, was your question less about what the department's going to do and more about perhaps people in the room or anyone kind of adjacent to this, what they're going to say on social media and how does that impact the process that's going to play, or is it more about us and what we're going to do?
For the people online, right? That you have a plan to be able to deal with social media. As I said, I fished with a guy who was a superintendent in a school district, and let me tell you, he had a plan for social media because it becomes a challenging communication process. And I don't know if Willamette Partnership has that role, but it can derail a whole. You can do your best public involvement, public information possible. It can derail some of that stuff, which I just want to. I'm one of those. I was a planner for a long time. Plan for those kind of things. Plan for the best, hope for the.
Yeah.
Do that process to make sure you're prepared.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And I think there's certainly a part of it for us to think about. And it's a good reminder to me to check in with our folks. But I also think there's opportunity for you all here with your social media channels. Like there's something here for everyone. And to the extent that this is going to be successful for whatever interests you have, helping manage that part of your kind of social media channels as well to make sure that the information is staying on point and on topic. Like that would really help. We're all going to need to be in this together.
Yeah.
So this problem did not occur overnight. I've worked in state and county governments most of my career, and even in the business world, you see it. One of the easiest things to do is defer maintenance. Okay, that's where you can save money in a hurry. Cutting personnel doesn't do it. You got to have so many paper clips, staples to run business. You defer maintenance because that's the easy one to cut. So we somehow need to get built into this to the legislature that you can't defer maintenance, that you're gonna have to pick it up and build new facilities or completely reconstruct. They're being handed the problem that started 20 and 30 and 40 years ago is finally time to pay the piper. And somehow we need to get that as part of this working group conveyed to them.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it's not just a problem of our hatcheries, our roads, schools, everything. And yeah, I think that goes to both the annual operating costs, but ensuring that there's sufficient funding to carry out those things, like you said. And that's, I think, also part of the discussion that the group should have. And how do we shore up that, not just the capital, but the funding to do this? And maybe it's not general fund, but maybe it's some other source. Certainly in Washington, there's a lot stronger support, $60 to $80 million a biennium for deferred maintenance. That's nothing like what we've got here. But yeah, so I think it's a good point, and we don't want to get in this scenario in 20 years' time.
Yeah, I'll just note as I'm thinking about facilitating the small group process and the conversation, what is coming to mind is sort of almost phases, like the lifespan of the decisions that need to be made and considerations that need to be taken into account over time. So there may be a sort of temporal nature to what the group suggests. Anybody online have any questions? And then I'll come back to you, Jennifer. We have one in the room, so we'll let you think. Go ahead.
All right, this is Jennifer. Yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of the kind of broad scale goal, vision, objective ideas that have been put out there. I'm also hoping that, as we kind of go through that, then we can drill down into more specifics and, have something, a recommendation to the department of, in this place, we think X, or we'd really like to take a look at Y. And I think we've heard a few of the kind of categories as well of things like deferred maintenance, as well as like managing risk over the long term. If we're consolidating facilities, but there could be a risk to any one facility in any given year, how do we build in redundancy to support the system? So I do think, I'm kind of hoping that we can go both starting with the broad, but then getting to some pretty specific places. And while, this is about hatcheries, it's also, as David pointed out, about wild fish, wild harvest as well. And so, how do those goals interplay with each other? How do those objectives work together? And what suggestions might we have for the agency on those fronts?
Thank you. It's a really good point. And we have I think you've seen the scale slides that Sean presents, and we have it again. I do think sort of adding to the complexity of what this this group has before it is this sort of sliding scale to very specific what needs to happen here at this facility to these big, broad statewide considerations. And we really do have to be able to do all of that, sort of all the scales in between as well. And so that's a great observation. Any other thoughts about what needs to be included? Concerns about what we're doing? Here, we have one here.
Don New, Hatchery and Wild Coexist in CCA, Oregon. I have two questions. Question and comment. One is how are these small groups composed? What do they look like? How are you making those decisions in terms of balance? And the second one is just a comment. I think it's incumbent. One of the reasons we're here, is to listen specifically and avoid how things can get convoluted. My favorite part of this whole study was that months and months and months ago, we were hearing about it, and there was a rumor going around that it was stacked, that there was a committee, in quote marks, that was going to make all the decisions, and it was stacked. Now, what makes no difference which way that is, but the decision's already been made. And that flew around the forums, it flew around a lot of stuff that I was involved with. And I really think it's important for us in this room and online, anyone else involved, to help dispel some of the nonsense. And I think the best, I've said this in the meeting before, the best thing about this is that it's very transparent. We're seeing the underbelly of the process. And I don't understand why there are 100 people in here and 300 people out there, but that's how this community operates. And I think we just have to be really judicious about the way we pass on information. So back to the question.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the comment portion of that too. If folks are ready, let's go ahead and start talking about the small groups. We did have a whole image here about how this all fits together, but I think we talked about it. Some of you have seen this before, so this will just be a brief stop. But this is just intended to sort of indicate where you all are. We're in the public engagement box. For those of you who are more visual, the third-party assessments, that's what we talked about all morning. Of course, ODFW is in consultation with tribes. And out of that, kind of on the same level there, will come the department's infrastructure blueprint. And of course, there will always be conversation with the legislature. So that's just a depiction of that. But let's talk about the small groups. So our plan for today is to talk about how the small group was selected, the intent of the group, and we already have talked a little bit about the work product that will be informed by this larger group, created by the smaller group. And then we wanted to talk a little bit about any opportunities or concerns you have about the small group. And we've made very clear all day today, we really want to make sure the small group and the larger group stay in conversation. And so we're interested in ideas to make that possible. So yes, because we're going to keep coming back to scale, part of the focus when the department was selecting the small group was selecting groups that have a statewide focus and the ability to get down to the hatchery level. So this ability to sort of go back and forth between a specific geography and statewide considerations. These are the small group organizations that are included. There are 10 of them in the process. So this will be, we don't have the names listed here, but these are the organizations that are going to participate in the small group process. And I hesitate to use the word on behalf of the large group, but the reason I hesitate is because you may look at this and say, I'm not actually affiliated with one of these groups, but we are expecting there to be communication back and forth between the small group and the larger group, and certainly between the small group and the department. And you, of course, always have access to us and the department. So that I think is, and this group may be familiar to you. We talked to several folks in this group for key informant interviews before we got started, kind of for the same reasons. These are groups that have a statewide focus and also some local connections and abilities to comment on the specific hatcheries. So I'm going to pause just with the who. Does anybody have questions or concerns about the selection of this small group? Sort of the way this group was created, and I might be able to help answer those. And Sean and Chris are here also because they certainly inform this process. They have a lot of relationships with all of you in the room, and specifically these folks too. Anybody online too? So what we're doing with the small groups, just so you know, the small group will meet, gosh, I think we have 5 meetings on the calendar for the small group over the course of September and October. And we expect the group to have work in between the meetings as well. And we will be, Willamette Partnership and the department will be in conversation with the small group and you folks who aren't in this group but are interested and have questions in between meetings. So it's going to be a pretty intense 8 to 10 weeks for this small group, with the expectation that at the end of it, we have sort of the group's offering to the department. We will come back together as a larger group to talk about that. We're going to have a conversation about how to keep lines of communication open. I can tell you our goal at Willamette Partnership is that when we come back together as a large group, you are not hearing for the first time what's been going on for 8 to 10 weeks, that you are, maybe seeing final product, but they're all ideas that you were aware were in the hopper and being developed, so that nobody should be surprised at the end of this when we meet. Any questions about the group before we, Leonard, please go ahead.
Was there a very specific or centric commercial fishing organization, specifically commercial salmon fishing organization, considered?
I am going to ask the department to chime in on that. So the question, there was a comment in response to your question in the room, Leonard, saying that we would want to go to the Oregon Salmon Commission.
Yeah, I believe there's been some outreach to the Oregon Salmon Commission, right, Chris? And although they're not going to be part of the small group, there are groups on the small group that do represent their kind of perspectives, and we will be keeping them kind of apprised of how things are going.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions about the composition of the group? Okay. How about the process for collaboration with this small group and this larger group? Are there preferences, ideas, suggestions for how the small group's work should be communicated to the larger group, or how you would like to sort of access the members of the smaller group? Yes, that's a great question. Online, Brian asks, for those of us not in the small group, who is our point of contact? So I think we need to have a small group meeting. Our thought was we just want to get the consent of everybody participating on the small group to be a point of contact. But Brian, in the meantime, Willamette Partnership, me, Teresa, or Kellen, who's not here today, we can be points of contact, and so can the department, Sean and Chris. So we are always good points of contact, and then we're just going to expand that list by including small group members as well. So that's one way to communicate. David, can we get you a mic so you can be heard? Oh, I think we went over that one, the opportunity to provide input. Yeah, we did that one. We have a comment in the room. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Jennifer. And Teresa, I'd be interested in your thoughts as the facilitator on this, but how to distill, the themes of the conversations that the small group is having while not necessarily attributing to individuals in the small group so that we can have very frank discussions and feel like we, I don't know, have the space to do that while still providing the larger group with relevant updates on how those conversations are progressing.
Yeah, and we, Kellen and I have talked about that, and we're sort of thinking about how to provide notes out of those meetings that would be available to the larger group so you could see the progress, but also not stifle conversation in the way you suggested. So I like that idea, and we're definitely open to that, and Willamette Partnership would provide those notes and distribute them so folks can keep up. We just want to make sure everybody in the group is comfortable with that before we do it. But it's a good one. Did I see another hand? Oh, there was a hand online. Steve, go ahead.
Yes, I think it would be very useful for us in the larger group to have whoever the point of contact's information available to everybody, so that if there are specific questions that come up that are very relative to something on a specific river or a specific hatchery, that the person with the question knows where to go. And not necessarily is that person part of these discussions. So right now, I have no idea who in any of these organizations other than Leonard, where I would go.
Yes, that's thank you for the comment. And it is our intent to share a list of the small group contacts, not just by organization, but by name and contact information. So you could email or call. We just wanted to have this conversation first and let the small group know that we wanted to do that before we did it. Question from Brian, is this small group subject to any public meeting requirements? I feel delightfully unlawyerly right now. For those who don't know, I'm trained as a lawyer, but I'm not acting as one here, so I don't feel like I have to answer that.
Not that I'm aware of. This is us. This is a group of folks getting together to talk about outcomes that they, areas of alignment. The department will be assisting them in that as kind of technical support, facilitated by partnership.
Yeah, that would be my understanding too. I don't think we have any public meeting requirements. Any other comments or questions about the small group process, ways you'd like to be communicated with? So we have notes coming out of the small group. We have obviously a contact list. Any other ideas? Go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, thank you. Jennifer alluded to this. I'm sure we're going to start off with discussing ground rules about, I'm in other negotiations in the region and across the state, and we're allowed to share our perspective, but we're not allowed to portray others' perspectives in our communications outside of these work groups. And it's just something to think about, is how we're going to set sidebars of sharing on social media what happens in these meetings and who says what. And things get misconstrued, and bias gets assigned that may or may not really be there. And so I'm sure as a facilitator, you put some thought into how to manage that.
Yes, we'll definitely, in the first small group meeting, spend probably quite a bit of time coming up with the ground rules and how we communicate with each other and others. But you're reminding me, Liz, with that question relative to the larger group, um, you know, while the small group's ground rules won't necessarily be ground rules for the larger group, it might be nice for you to know them. So that, to the point of social media use, if you see folks construing kind of, conversations from small groups and open public fora, you could step in and say that's not really supposed to be happening. So that might be something we want to share back out with the larger group, and we can talk to the small group about that. And then as the larger group, you, of course, would also be welcome to set some agreements with yourselves here about this process and how you want to talk about it, or how you want to support it, how you don't want to talk about it in the public. And that would be up to the larger group. Steve, I see your hand up, and then there's also a question I'll get to in the chat.
Wondering about, you said there were going to be 4 or 5 or some number of meetings of the small group. Will there be an agenda that's published so that the rest of us might know what's going to be discussed? It might be a rationale for why we'd want to get in contact with some of the people that are, basically assigned to interface with us. And then after the meeting, is there going to be results posted that we might be able to respond to and help out with in some fashion?
Thanks. Those are both reasonable requests from my perspective. And yes, we've talked about the notes after the meeting, but I think it makes a ton of sense to give you an agenda ahead of the meeting, and maybe we come up with a time frame that works for folks, that we can meet and the small group can meet, but gives you enough time to read it and reach out to people if you want to have conversation. So I think that's a great suggestion. Thanks. I'm going to read a question in the chat, and then I see you, Leonard. Let's see. Will everyone who signed up for these presentations and meetings be on the email list for communicating what is happening with the groups? Great question. I'm not sure how your communication list works. I'm looking to the department.
So anyone who's signed up online through our website for the email notifications will get a notification that we put something new on the website around this.
Okay. So everyone who is here should definitely go sign up to receive notifications for the website, and we can talk about if that's where we want to post the agendas and the notes.
Yeah, I think again, part of it's going to depend on the ground rules that the small group set. So that's why I'm waffling a little bit. That anything we do post on there, you will get a notification. So if you haven't signed up on the website, go there today and sign up.
Okay. And thanks for raising this question. We'll circle back with a solid answer about who's receiving what via email on the web as soon as we have that first small group meeting, so it's very clear. Leonard?
Yes, I'd just like to comment on Liz's comment. That's an interesting comment about a code of conduct for the small work groups, maybe not presenting their personal opinion, maybe not their organization's opinion, but I think this mission is to secure dedicated funding for hatchery improvements or infrastructure repairs. So as long as the stakeholders or small groups are staying within that and not convoluting the message, making it confusing, it's just got to be a clear message for the public and our legislators that this is where we all want to go. And we're all unified in this. Would that be a fair statement?
I don't want to speak on behalf of the small group because we're not assembled here. What your comment is making me think about is whether or not part of the communication out after small group meetings is a talking point. So there may be communication about the themes of the conversation, but could we also develop a talking point or two that would be safe to share about where we're at in the process and how it's going? So I'm giving that a little bit of thought. What do you think about that, Leonard?
Yeah, I think, like you said, we'll probably settle that out in a small work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right off the bat. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a good point. Any other thoughts online or in the room about the small group process, things you want the small group to hear before they get going? I think it's kind of amazing everyone's still awake. It's so cold. That's why we did that. Okay, I think this is very helpful feedback for us as facilitators about how to keep a meaningful connection between the two groups. This isn't the end of the conversation. If you walk out of this room and think to yourself, actually, I think this would be useful, you can always reach out to me or to Kellen or to the department, and we're happy to take that into account. Same thing is true throughout this process. If something goes wrong, and I think we should all just plan for some moment of something going wrong, please reach out and let us know what's happening. We aren't sort of all over social media seeing everything that's posted or hearing all of the conversation. So it's helpful to know what's going on out in the wild and not just in these rooms. Okay. We are sort of winding down and it's 3 o'clock, and I don't know that anybody will be angry about that. These are the next steps that we have talked about today. The small group meetings are scheduled and will take place in September and October. We are going to put together a small group contact list and notes and send that to the interested parties list. A reminder to sign up on ODFW's website. And then the next meeting of this group is November 13th. So this broad group will come back together. As I said, November 13th should not be the next time you hear something about what the small groups are doing. So if it feels that an unusual amount of time has passed and you haven't received something, please reach out to your friends who may have. Please reach out to the department or to Willamette Partnership and let us know something's gone wrong with the communication. You're not getting what you expect to get. Let's see. I don't see any other questions online or in the chat or in the room. Anything else on anyone's mind that you want to share before we finish here today? Oh, the website address. That's a great question. Do we have it over here?
We're putting it in the chat right now.
Oh, great. It's in the chat, but maybe not. Yep. Hold on. I don't see it in the chat yet. There it is. Yeah, if you are able to share your screen, I can unshare. It would be nice to just take a look at it. Or I can do it, either way. So that one suggestion is Google ODFW hatchery resilience, and you can find it. That is how I do it. Here, we're going to give Linda the microphone so you can hear her.
This is sharing my screen to the ODFW public-facing website. And if I back up a little bit, so once you're on our website, you go here and it's public website. And then you go down to fish hatcheries. And then you click on this link. And this is where you would sign up right here. Red envelope, and there's a link. If you don't already have an account, you'll need to create one. Super easy, email address, a password, and you're good. And then just click on it to sign up for the notices.
Thanks, Linda. And when we send out notes in the contact list from, as we're going to do with the small group, we will make sure to put the website on those notes so that you can access it there in case you have trouble finding it. Okay. I think with that, do you, Sean and Chris, have anything else to share?
I think I've done a lot of talking today, and probably when I get home, I'll get accused of words running out. But just thank you all for being here today. I know it's been a lengthy meeting, so thanks for sticking with it, and thanks really for participating in this. It's important to the department, and I know it's important to you all, and I think we're going to build something good here. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. Please reach out with any questions and have a safe drive. Bye to everyone online.